and welcome to this afternoon's webinar on simplifying progress monitoring using goal attainment scaling. So glad you could all join us. My name is Ann Jung, and I'm co-founder and chief academic officer for ASCD Student Growth Center. And we're connecting with ASCD primarily in their desire to promote greater equity and inclusion of all students. And one of our areas of contribution is in creating software and methods and procedures to help those who are including students who are struggling or who have disabilities to make their jobs easier. And one of the areas that we know teachers and teams really struggle a lot with is in the area of data collection, progress monitoring, reporting how students are performing. And for those students who have IEPs, those students who qualify under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, we know that we must be able to demonstrate progress. And in fact, you may have heard back in March of the Andrew F. versus Douglas County Board of Education Supreme Court case in which the Supreme Court unanimously ruled in favor of Drew's family, stating that his previous school had not been able to demonstrate progress. So we already knew that this was a concern, and as I know many of you know that progress monitoring it can be challenging and difficult to coordinate, and this Supreme Court ruling certainly emphasized the necessity for us to really think about progress monitoring and reporting how we're doing. So what I'd like to do first is I'd like to give a poll here just to learn about how your teachers within your school or your district are currently taking regular data on student progress. We'll give you just a second to read these options. Everybody has their own way, their own data sheets. All teachers take data the exact same way. You're not sure, or we're not taking regular data. And no worries, your login is not associated with your poll response. So we encourage you just to let us know what you know. And so far, it looks like everybody knows. We'll give just a few more seconds for everyone to vote. All right, so this is what we have. We have a couple of people unsure of how data is collected. There are some of you who say that all teachers take data in the same way, and I want to explore that with you in just a bit. But most of you did say that all teachers have their own individual ways of collecting data. They have their own data sheets. And that's certainly what I experienced as an educator and continue to experience as I visit schools as a consultant, is that most of the time teachers and related service providers have their own ways of taking data and often involve literal sheets of paper where data are collected. So my background is in special education. I entered the field of special education in 1994 and worked diligently on improving progress monitoring as a special educator. This became my area of research interest, along with supporting families. And then quite a few years later, my children were diagnosed with dyslexia. And so now I've had experience on the other side of the table and receiving other people's data sheets, and truly those experiences have made it even more compelling that we must consider the way that we're measuring progress and collecting data. And what I found is that most of the people on my children's teams have collected data in different ways. What I'd like to do is ask for those of you who said all teachers take data the same way, I'd like for somebody to perhaps respond on, what do you mean by this? Are all teachers using the same type of data sheet, or are any of you out there using goal attainment scaling already and are perhaps looking for different ways to use goal attainment scaling? I have been in schools where teachers do all use the same data sheet, but sometimes this can be limiting. It can be a frequency data sheet or a percentage only data sheet. So if someone would like to respond on what they mean by all teachers are taking data the same way, we can come back and revisit that question. And here is how everyone responded, so you can see that. All right, so as I mentioned, part of ASCD Student Growth Center includes software that we're developing for supporting teachers measuring of progress and developing of growth plans. And so if you're interested in that, you can browse to goalworks.org after the webinar to learn more about that. But what is important is that the practice that we'll be discussing in this webinar transcends any kind of program. It doesn't matter what software program you're using or if you're using sheets of paper. The practice of goal attainment scaling is best practice for measuring progress on individualized goals. This is how you can get in touch with us. Our website is studentgrowth.org. My email address is young@studentgrowth.org, and you can follow us on Twitter. My Twitter handle is Leanne Jung, and our center's Twitter handle is ASCD-SGC. This webinar on goal attainment scaling is part of a larger workshop that I do on supporting and measuring growth for students with learning differences. If you browse to our website and click on Professional Learning Services, PLS/events, you can then find a description of all of our workshops and institutes and download a handout that goes along with this webinar. So we have one single learning target for our time together, and this is to design a scale to measure progress on individualized learning and behavior goals. So some of you may have more interest in how do we measure progress on academic goals. Others of you may be more interested in behavioral goals. And some of you may have questions about all of the above. And the good news is that goal attainment scaling and the scale that we'll work with today brings together any kind of goal that you're interested in measuring a student's progress on. In fact, someone brought up the other day, we were in DC, and someone said, we could use this to measure teachers' goals. We could have goals for teachers, and you could. Really, goal attainment scaling is a universal ruler on which we can put any goal that we're interested in measuring. In the fall, there will be a book coming out from ASCD. This is a working title. We're not sure what the final title will be, but you can look for a book on this topic and much more, including how do we write goals, how do we measure progress, how do we include families, how do we design strategies, and that will be coming this fall. So what I'd like for us to do next is to think about, why do we need unified plans for measuring learning and behavior? Why is it better to have everyone collecting data in the same way as opposed to each teacher having his or her own data sheet? And so I'd like for us to take just a minute to think about this, and perhaps some of you can respond why it might be better to have everyone collecting data in the same way. Absolutely, Beth. That is one of the reasons, so that the whole team is looking for a consistent response and know when the goal has been reached. We need to be able to understand one another's data. It helps us to have fidelity with our data, to be able to compare data with one another. Absolutely. And we do need to be able to interpret data in the same way to ensure that there's growth. If people are collecting data in different ways, we do have to spend some energy trying to interpret one another's data. Yes, when teachers have the same progress monitoring or response to instruction and intervention tools or sheets developed either by the team or by a coach and monitored by a coach or an administrator, we can easily identify target areas. Exactly. So if everyone is able to understand everyone's data, we can determine direction. Without having that, it's really difficult for us to make decisions about an individual student or about our school or district. So for example, if we're having difficulty understanding one another's data, we have to wait until we all get together and for each person on the team to describe how the student's performing, to really annotate whatever type of quantitative data are being taken. And so that's not as efficient as everyone being able to understand the data that have been taken. I can tell you many times that I've received data sheets home about my children, and I had difficulty understanding them. And I have degrees in special education, and it makes me wonder, what are families who don't have backgrounds in special education or in education, or perhaps families with low literacy levels, or families who maybe had poor experiences with school? How are they interpreting the data? Do they feel a part of the team? So not only does everyone need to understand the data for us to be able to determine direction for the student, but just to feel a part of the team. If one person is collecting data and the data is confusing to everyone else may feel that that person is the expert and maybe I don't have as much to contribute to the team. And so we want data to be something that everyone on the team can understand so we can make decisions about the student. It also means we need to all understand the data across students so we can make decisions as a school. So if we can understand how all of our students in the school are performing on reading goals, for example, or writing goals, this can help us make decisions. So if we see that students are struggling to meet their writing goals, or that we have many, many writing goals on our IEPs or individualized growth plans, that tells me as an administrator, perhaps I need to make a hire in this area, or perhaps I need resources in terms of in the form of professional learning, or perhaps I need to bring in a consultant to help in the area of writing. So being able to look at our data not only by student and understand it, but look at it across students and across schools to be able to make bigger decisions as schools and districts is important. So this is an important case for having data that we can all understand. Yes, and having unified data means a unified approach to achievement. Absolutely. So if we're all working using the same metrics, we have an easier time understanding how the student is performing and can spend more of our energy on designing intervention and how we want to respond. So the focus of our discussion this afternoon is on goal attainment scaling. Goal attainment scaling is something I was introduced to as a researcher, not as I was in my personnel preparation program becoming a special education teacher. In my personnel preparation program, I was taught that you could take data many different ways. You could take frequency counts, you could measure duration, you could look at level of independence, but that you created data sheets for each of those ways of taking data. And many of you may have had that experience as well, that you can take data in a lot of different ways, but each one requires a different type of data sheet. As a researcher, when I was a professor at University of Kentucky, colleagues of mine and I had a National Institutes of Health funded study where we measured the relative effects of web-based versus face-to-face coaching of teachers of young children with autism. And as we conducted this study, we had to measure students' progress on individualized goals. We did measure their progress on standardized measures, but we also measured their progress on individualized goals. And goal attainment scaling is the gold standard within research of how we measure progress on individualized goals. And what I realized is that we really should be using that practice in every classroom. There's nothing about goal attainment scaling that is so complex. In fact, goal attainment scaling makes data collection simpler. It makes progress monitoring easier. And so at that point, I began a quest to revise an intervention planning process that I'd been working on for more than 10 years to include goal attainment scaling, improve the way that we measure progress. And so it went through a variety of iterations until we arrived at the goal attainment scale that we use now, that I'll share with you this afternoon. So this is a screenshot of GoalWorks, which is the software that we've been developing to design intervention and measure progress. And I'll just orient you quickly to the form so that you can see what I'm talking about when we drill down to the goal attainment scale. At the top of the form, this is where our annual goal goes. So this would be a student's IEP goal, or if a student doesn't have an IEP, we still may have a goal. As you all know, most of the students who are behind grade level or who are underperforming do not have a disability. Many students are instructional casualties or have had limited opportunities or different types of opportunities that have limited their success. To the right of this include the settings. These are the settings in which we want to measure progress. So when we design a goal attainment scale, it's not to be used in an isolated setting only. So unlike perhaps many of us were taught, we no longer pull students aside from the general curriculum to administer trials of something to see how they performed, but rather we want to see how they're performing on the skills and behaviors they need in natural settings. So we identify the settings. Below this is the data map. This is where we record a student's score from the goal attainment scale, and below the goal attainment scale are the list of strategies we're using. In this webinar, we're focusing on this portion of an intervention or growth plan, which is the goal attainment scale. You can see that our goal attainment scale has 9 points on it. It moves from 0 to 4. 0 is baseline. 4 is the annual goal. The reason that we have 9 steps on our goal attainment scale is because there are 9 months in an academic year. And so we have calibrated our scale so that students are expected to move 1 box per academic month. Now, a common question is, well, what if a student's growth is not linear? They don't move exactly one box per month. That's to be expected some of the time. Sometimes students gain part of a skill quickly, and then sometimes students make progress slowly in the beginning and then quicker in the end. And of course, that's okay. So the goal attainment scale that we have has 9 points on it. It's an adapted goal attainment scale. Sometimes in research, we see 5 points on a goal attainment scale. So ours is modified to fit the practical needs of K-12 teachers, pre-K-12 teachers. You can see that on our goal attainment scale, although there are 9 points on the scale, only 5 points are named. In survey research, this is called anchoring. So you've probably completed many surveys in your life, and you've often seen Likert scales where there are 7 possible numbers, but only every other one of them has a word attached to it. And that's called anchoring in survey research. And so we use that practice so that teachers are not having to name every step on the scale. So this saves time in terms of planning, but it doesn't lose anything in terms of fidelity of implementation. So this is where we're determining the increments of progress toward the goal. So wherever the student is performing on the goal attainment scale gets mapped onto the data map. And again, if you want to see more about how we use goal attainment scale and map it and interpret that, you can watch our demo on GoalWorks. So setting the scale is the most time-consuming part of a growth plan or an intervention plan, but it is important that we invest this time up front because it saves us a whole lot of time in the end. If you've ever gotten to the point where you're needing to take data and you realize, oh, this goal really wasn't measurable, I really can't measure if it's at 80%, then you realize that we do need to invest time up front in setting our scale and determining our measure so that when it's time to take data, taking data takes seconds. Each data point is seconds and is incredibly accurate. One thing that we know from decades of research on IEPs and goals and IFSP goals is that adding a number doesn't necessarily make a goal measurable. And we commonly see goals that something will happen with 80% accuracy on 3 out of 4 trials. And that sounds measurable, but many times it's smoke and mirrors. It's not really measurable. We can't really measure this goal. Spencer will read each of the adult sight words for 2nd grade with 75% accuracy. Now, it appears to be measurable because the goal says with 75% accuracy. But how do you read a word with 75% accuracy? How do you read? Do you count the letters and then calculate a proportion? So we can't really do it this way. Some people might respond, well, what they really mean is Spencer will read 75% of the adult sight words accurately. Well, they could have meant that, but even that's not quite right, because you could read 100% of the words accurately and not have a single sight word. That is, you could decode every single one of the words, but not have a single sight word. So knowing the percentage of words that you read accurately is really not enough. We need to know how quickly do you do it. Sight words are really about speed. They're really about latency. How quickly after you saw the word did you read it? Do you have automaticity? So here's another way to phrase this. Spencer will read each of the adult sight words for 2nd grade within 2 seconds of being presented the word. Now we're getting at what we really need to measure. How quickly did he read each word after he saw it? So you can see that having a measurable goal is much more than simply adding a number. We have to know what is important to measure. Exactly how are we going to measure this? And then we need to map out a trajectory of success. This is a great myth. I'm not sure how this myth got started, that 80% equals mastery, but somewhere along the line, someone decided that 80% meant mastery, and that sort of stuck. But percentages of success are relative to how difficult the goal is. Sometimes 80% is not enough. I'm never going to write a goal that my children will cross the street safely 80% of the time. That's not enough. It's the wrong question, too. Getting across the street safely is going to happen 100% of the time. The right question to ask is, well, how much help did they need to get across the street? Did they do it independently? Did I only have to look at them, or did I have to hold my hands out to stop them? Did I have to ask them a question? What do we need to do when we cross the street? That's the more important question. How much help did they need versus how often did they get across safely? We have many different rulers available to us in education to measure behavior and learning. And we want to identify the right ruler to use, and then we want to put it on the goal attainment scale. When we put any of these types of data onto the goal attainment scale, it allows us to interpret data the same way. We get used to seeing the same type of scale, and we know if we're on track to meet a goal. So I'd like to go through several types of ways that we can collect data and to think about when this would be useful. And then I want to be able to take your questions and thoughts on using data. Before I get started with the different types of data, I'd like to ask one more question as a poll. How useful do you feel the data on progress for students is now? Do you feel that everyone understands the data and it drives our decisions about that student? Do you feel like you use data for decision making, but the data aren't always clear? Do you feel like the data aren't clear at all, so we use meetings and anecdotal evidence to make decisions? Or do you feel like we really just don't have reliable data of any type that we can make decisions? All right, so this is what you all said. For the most part, you said you use data for your decision making, but the data aren't always clear. And some of you said that your data are not clear at all, so you use meetings and anecdotal evidence to make decisions. And then there were a few who were on either end. So using goal attainment scaling and using multiple ways of taking data, depending on what the goal is our best way to have clear data that we can use to make decisions. So duration. Duration is, with duration data, we measure how long something happened. So this is useful when you want something to happen for a longer period of time. You're measuring the length of a behavior. So can anybody think of an example when we might want to measure how long something happens? So one of my favorite examples, and please feel free to chime in, remaining on task, time on task. You all are coming up with the answer, yes, sitting at a table, playing cooperatively. Some of them are to the panelists and some of them are going to everyone. So I'm seeing a few more than you all are. But yes, engagement. So we know that students learn when students are engaged. And so a common goal, yes, attention, focus. So a lot of times teachers and parents are wanting students to stay on task or to stay engaged in the curriculum longer. And so in this example, we may have a student who right now is able to stay engaged for 5 minutes, and we want the student by the end of the year to be engaged for 45 minutes. So we ask the team, what is the student doing now? How is the student able to be engaged now? And we would say 5 minutes, and so that becomes the 0. The next question we ask is, what do we think we can accomplish by the end of a year with excellent intervention? And so the team agrees on 45 minutes. So goal attainment scaling is a team-based process. It's not that a single individual determines the scale, but rather we use our existing data on the student and the student's growth to determine how we populate our scale. And then we ask, what do we think that can happen after 2 months, and after 2 more months, and after 2 more months? And that's how we populate, that's how we answer the question, what's our first benchmark, our second benchmark, and our third benchmark. Most schools do have, continue to have benchmarks for goals for IEPs. It's no longer a part of IDEA's requirements that we have benchmarks. Benchmarks are still good practice. It's still excellent practice to have benchmarks. IDEA does require that for students who qualify for an IEP, that we say whether they're on track to meet their annual goal. And I'm not sure how we would say they're on track to meet their annual goal or not if we didn't have benchmarks. And so although IDEA does not explicitly say we must have benchmarks, this is still good practice. And we feel it should be as accurately determined by the team as possible. Sometimes we do guess wrong though. Sometimes we get midway through the year and figure out we didn't implement the right intervention, or we set the goal too high, but we do want to shoot high. Both Andrew versus Douglas County Board of Education and a letter written by OSEP a couple of years ago compel us to shoot for grade level expectations when we can. And even when grade level expectations are not possible, we want to have comparably rigorous goals for students. So we want whatever we put in this for, whatever we put for our goal, to be something that is rigorous and something achievable, but something that is rigorous. Some of you may have lived in states or been in parts of districts where all goals must be written at grade level. This is not best practice. Kentucky did this a number of years ago and reversed that because writing goals on grade level is appropriate if for that individual student grade level expectation is appropriate. But we know that not all students are working toward grade level expectations. For some students, we're temporarily working toward a modified expectation, and for other students, grade level expectations may not be something that is possible. And so we always write our expectations based on the individual student and the individual student's data. Another type of data is frequency. So frequency is useful when we want something to happen more times or fewer times. It's useful when we can easily count something. So what are some examples of behaviors or skills that are conducive to counting? And you'll see that I have one here included from the Common Core. We want students to be able to include citations. We want them to offer more than their opinions in their writing, but when they are writing, we want them to be able to cite sources. We want them to be able to cite evidence. Yes, aggressive behavior. So if a student is having emotional outbursts or having physical aggression, it is easy to count those. And so we can set a goal. The valence would be reduced, though. The higher number would be at the bottom and the lower number would be at the top when it's something we want to go down. So when it's something we want to have fewer times, so we would want to have 0 physically aggressive moments. The 0, that 0 aggression would be our 4. That would be our goal. Grammar and spelling errors, absolutely. So we could count grammar and spelling errors. I'm going to give you another option for grammar and spelling and conventions of writing in a bit that may even be more useful than frequency count. So this is when we want something to happen more times or fewer times. And again, we say, what is the student doing now? That's the 0. What do we want to have happen by the end of the year? That's a 4. Completing or turning in assignments. Yes, we could count how many assignments were turned in or how many assignments were late. Latency. Okay, this is when we want something to happen quicker. We want to, for those of you who are trained in applied behavior analysis or have some awareness of this, we want the distance between the antecedent and the behavior to be reduced. We want the distance between a prompt and the behavior we want to see happen. We want this to be shorter. So, or it could be if we wanted to have, we could want the latency to increase. Most of the time it's when we want something to decrease. So, for example, I might like for the latency between when I say it's time to go and my children are in the car and ready to go with all their stuff, I might want that latency to decrease. The example that I gave earlier of sight words, seeing the sight word and reading it, I might want that latency to decrease. To begin working on assignments, yes, that's a perfect example. So I might say it's okay, everyone, it's time to work, and I've given a prompt for independent work, and we may have a student who doesn't get to work right away, and that happens often at certain grade divisions, right? So that may be that would be an excellent example of latency. The time between I've said it's time to begin an activity and the students work on that activity. Level of independence is one of the most useful and least used measures of progress. So this is useful when we want to see an increased independence with a skill, and we measure how much help the student needed to demonstrate it. And there are a number of things I want to say about level of independence. One of the ways it is used is to show a decrease in number of prompts needed. So we might see a team say, okay, well, the student needs 5 prompts to get started on their work. So that's the baseline, and I want the 4 to be no prompts, no individual prompts. I do discourage teams from using level of independence goal attainment scales in this way, because if it required 5 prompts, the prompt didn't work. And we really want to think about how much of a prompt, what was different about the type of prompt. So we want to think about actually decreasing the level of our prompt. So it might be, this example here is for editing work. And so right now the student only meets criteria of accurate conventions of writing when the errors have been marked and I've given the correction. And we all know that that's really a missed learning opportunity. We only want to mark errors and give the correction after everything else didn't work. Because when we mark errors and give the correction, the student misses a chance to learn that. And so we can start really with giving a student a checklist for editing, maybe a reminder to give to use the checklist. We could give the student a number or type of errors within a paragraph or a page, but not mark them. Or we might highlight the errors, but not give the actual correction. Those are many different levels of prompts. That's 5 different levels of giving the student a prompt rather than just saying this number of prompts. So we do want to think about that. Level of independence, we see, I've not included any numbers, or the numbers are what are on the scale, 0 to 4, but the words that go with the numbers are used in the way that we would populate any rubric. We can use words, not only numbers, on our goal attainment scale. Another thing that I'd like to mention about level of independence is that oftentimes we provide what we would call accidental modifications. So a student is having difficulty with writing. Let's say the student's having difficulty with writing and editing their writing. And so we send that student with the assignment to learning support or a resource room or a special education teacher or an assistant to get help. And that person provides a lot of prompts and a lot of support to bring the quality of work up. And then the work is then measured in the same way everybody's work has been measured, when in fact, we've provided a modification. We've provided prompts that helped the student's work improve without acknowledging that. And so anytime we are providing a lot of prompts, or if we have a shadow teacher, a teacher that's with a student all day, prompting behaviors, or if we're prompting academically, we always want to have a system in place to fade those prompts. And oftentimes we want to measure how the student performs and how the student becomes more independent. Proportion is another way of taking data. This is useful. Unlike frequency, this is useful when there are varied numbers of opportunities. So we can use a percentage or a proportion of steps that a student completed. So we might say there are 9 steps in completing homework. I've got to write it down in my agenda. I've got to collect the right materials. I've got to take the materials home. I've got to get started. I've got to keep going. I've got to finish. I've got to pack it back up. I've got to take it back to school and turn it in. So we might say those are the 9 steps of completing homework. And so we can use proportion to say how many steps did this student complete. And the proportion 9 of 9 lets you know when the student has completed all of the steps. We could also use percentage. There's no reason we can't use percentage. But I will say that percentage is often used inappropriately. It's often used artificially when that skill or behavior can't actually be measured by using a percentage. So we want to use percentage when it's appropriate, but only when it is. We can also use words. We don't even have to use numbers. So this one could be a scale that we use for intonation. So, when we think about how in the world do we measure that a student used intonation that matched the context and matched the punctuation, well, we can use goal attainment scaling and words to categorize rather than try to calculate or count. We can categorize how the student read with intonation. And so it may be that the student didn't use appropriate intonation for any of the reading. Right now, the student reads very robotically and does not attend to, you get the idea. And it may be that our goal is that the student uses intonation to read the entire passage or the entire paragraph or entire passage with intonation. And then we can have descriptions of this of the intermediary steps for our 1, 2, and 3. Quality. So sometimes describing how the student is performing is more meaningful than giving any type of count, and using a quality description may be most useful. And so much like we did with proportion and level of independence, we can talk about the quality of a student's performance. So this is for a young child or a child with physical disabilities or multiple disabilities who is learning to write letters. And so right now the student is able to copy a shape, but not copy or trace a letter. And so the next step would be to trace a letter, then to trace multiple complete letters, then to copy a letter legibly, and then copy multiple complete letters legibly. So we've mapped out exactly how the student's trajectory of growth should look over the course of a year. And we can use this quality measure for many, many types of skills and behaviors. So often we see a percentage attached to a skill or behavior when really quality is the only way to measure, or the best way, or the easiest way that we can measure. As you'll notice as I go through these, each of these scales is designed, as I mentioned earlier, to be used in a variety of settings. We want to be able to measure this student's writing skills, not only with a special education teacher, but at any point during the day when writing is an opportunity. So this may happen during a formalized writing time, or it may happen in any subject or in any routine of the day when there is a chance for the student to write. And so in that way, it can be the general education teacher who uses the goal attainment scale to mark progress, or it may be a specialist, it may be an assistant, it can be a parent. Anybody on the team who has been a part of developing or has been shown the goal attainment scale can then implement it and measure the student's progress within natural settings and routines. Next is rate. So many of the goals that we have are not time sensitive, but there are a few where rate is important. And one of the ways that we measure reading fluency is words per minute read. And so we might measure a student's words per minute read. We used to measure people's ability to type at a certain rate. Now 4-year-olds can type, and we don't need to measure that anymore. So we can certainly measure words per minute read. So for reading fluency, for math fluency, any skill for which we want to see automaticity, which we want to see rate increase, we can use this. Also, earlier someone brought up errors. So how many conventions of writing errors, so maybe spelling or punctuation, and we can do that via rate as well. So we could do number of errors per paragraph or per sentence or per page, depending on the student's current level of development or baseline. So we use a rate when we want something to happen faster. Theoretically, we could use it for something that we wanted to happen slower, but that would be much less common. Task analysis, for those of you who are trained in special education, we were all trained to do task analysis with toothbrushing, hand washing, and toileting, but we can also task analyze any behavior or skill. And so earlier I brought up an example of one where we had steps of submitting homework. We can actually name those steps and put them on the scale. So right now the student needs a prompt just to write the homework in the agenda. And what we want to have happen is for the student to independently submit homework in class, independently have completed all of the steps of completing homework. And we will have task analyzed this and written it into our strategies and have a method in place for implementing this to support the student. In this case, we would probably use backward chaining, where we would support the student all the way through the process, except with the last step. And then once the student had the last step, then we would prompt the student, stop prompting the second to last step. And so we would be able to measure where the student was on needing prompts. So we simply divide the behavior or skill into steps and we measure which steps were mastered. Once we've done this, once we've gone through the process of creating the goal attainment scale, we can measure a student's progress. The way that I teach measuring progress is to do it by setting. So you'll see that in the A column under the data map, we have data points there. Everything in the A column corresponds with the A setting, which is language arts. So the language arts teacher or someone using work that was submitted in language arts measures the error rate and records that in that column. And when we do it in this way, we can start to see a pattern, especially when you use color. When we use color, it's visual representation of the data, and you can see very quickly how the student is performing. And so when we do this, we're able to make database decisions about the student's performance. We can see, is the student on track to get to a 4 by the end of the year? We could also see, is the student performing better in one setting than the other? How is the student performing in language arts relative to social studies? And we can see the student, wow, the student did perform better in social studies for a little while. I wonder why. I wonder what was happening during those weeks. So our data collection process doesn't necessarily answer the questions for us, but it certainly gives us the questions to ask as a team. Why are things going the way that they are? Perhaps the student's performing, making progress much slower in science, and we determine as a team that it's because the academic language in science is more difficult, and that's why the student's making more errors. Perhaps it's not fair to hold the student to the same expectation in new science vocabulary as we do in film vocabulary, which may be more familiar to the student. And so we allow that to vary, and we're okay with that as a team. Or maybe we say, it doesn't seem like things are going so well in social studies, and maybe we determined the social studies teacher hadn't been implementing the intervention. So there are many reasons that a student may perform well or not as well in any setting, but having data recorded in this way allows us to look at a landscape of the student's data, and every goal is mapped in the exact same way, which allows us to quickly understand our data and spend all of our cognitive energy on making decisions and interpreting our data, rather than spending our energy trying to understand how one another collected data. Again, this is the website where you can browse to look at the way that we've designed our intervention plan, our growth plan. But what I'd really like to do now is, since we've got about 6 minutes left, I'd like to take your questions. And you can ask these either in the Q&A box or in the chat box. If you're comfortable letting everyone see your question, please type those there. And I'd love to take your questions at this point. So the goal attainment scaling process, you can see that it does take a team-based effort to determine where is the student now, where do we think the student can be by the end of a year. But once this is in place, then the data collection process is really simple. And we see this really as the key to helping all team members be on the same page in measuring progress and being able to meaningfully interpret data. So while people do consider questions that you might have, I'd like to launch a final poll on how useful this was to you. And here is our contact information again. So if you have a question that you'd like to send to us, or that you can find my email address here, Twitter addresses are here. Also, we encourage you to visit our website, studentgrowth.org. We regularly post blog entries. We do have a blog entry on goal attainment scaling, but we also have many other blog entries that you might find useful for your professional learning communities to discuss, and a number of other resources available. So a few questions have come in. Does GoalWorks run on an iPad? Yes, the program is agnostic to the platform, so you're able to use it on an iPhone, an iPad, desktop of any type. It's a cloud-based service. Is there a working document that can be adjusted by anyone, or is it more like a template that specific cells can be typed in? If I'm understanding your question correctly, it really is about the fields. It really is, the goal attainment scale is, it's 9 points, and any description of learning or behavior can go there. The goal attainment the growth plan is a form that we've worked on. Lots of schools have some version of an intervention plan or a growth plan, but this particular one is based on the research that I've conducted and reviewed over the past 15 years. Can goal attainment scale be used in secondary schools? Absolutely. There's no limit to the age. This can be used with infants and toddlers through adults. Goal attainment scaling simply is a ruler, and much like a ruler can have centimeters or inches, this is simply a ruler on which we can place any description of learning or behavior. So it can absolutely be used at any grade division or any age level. If a person is in a district that requires goals for all students to be at grade level, what do you do? What do you suggest for talking points? I would suggest the most recent Supreme Court decision, Andrew versus Douglas. And if you email me, I can also send you a letter written by OSEP, which a couple of years ago said that goals must be rigorous. They must be on grade level when that's possible. But that when that's not possible, goals should be written at a level that is comparably rigorous. The Office of Special Education Programs does not want us writing goals that are not achievable. That's inappropriate. So for a student who's 3, 4, 5 grade levels behind, it would be inappropriate to write a goal at grade level. And I think that has answered all of the questions that came in. We really appreciate your participation, and hope that you'll visit our website and be on the lookout for additional webinars. If you follow us on Twitter, you'll be sure to get notices of future webinars. Thanks for attending.